When Chad Boughton first got into bioelectronic medicine 20 years ago, he never imagined he'd be able to read someone's mind. The innovative field is one of the fastest growing segments of healthcare. It merges conventional medicine with technology by using implantable medical devices to interact with human tissue. For Boughton's first assignment, he was tasked to decode the brain signals of a paralyzed woman to figure out which patterns correlated to muscle movement.
The challenge is, well, how do you make sense of these signals that have never been recorded in a human over extended periods of time, because they do change over time as well? And how do you crack that neural code? Well, I like to say it's kind of like learning a foreign language. You use association. So you're going to have someone's going to point to things, or you point to objects, and someone's going to say the correct terminology in that language, and you're going to associate those things in your brain. So we do a technique where we have the participant, the user or the patient, watch different imagery, watch someone moving their hand, or in this case, we have a virtual hand on the screen, and we collect the brain activity at the same exact time.
And then they teased out the signals that had repeating patterns whenever the patient watched the virtual hand move. Boughton is Vice President of Advanced Engineering at Northwell Health and Director of the Neural Bypass and Brain-Computer Interface Laboratory at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. Once the team was able to distinguish the movement signals, they studied the specific neurons to see how often and quickly they fire and how strong each burst is. Once all of that information was compiled, they began to teach this language to an AI system.
We used to use something that was kind of an early crude technique, and now we use more advanced neural networks that really try to behave like the human brain in a sense, but it's running in a computer, and we learn these patterns. And then for too long, someone can simply think about movements they would like to achieve. We know what they're thinking about. In a way, we're reading their minds.
And now they're able to link those signals back to the patient's muscles using a method called a neural bypass. The technology intercepts the signals and reroutes them around the damaged part of the brain.
It kind of sounds like science fiction because we place tiny chips in the brain. These are electrode arrays, and we put them in the motor and sensory areas. And this is for people who are living with paralysis, either from a stroke or an injury, a traumatic injury like spinal cord injury. And what happens is we place these chips after many months of planning and doing MRI imaging, but we basically link those electronically to a computer, and then we link the computer back to stimulation devices that are on the body to stimulate muscles and also even over the spinal cord.
The first iteration of this process was a one-way link from the brain to the muscle, meaning that someone could think about moving their hand and the technology would make it happen. Now Boughton has developed what he calls a double neural bypass. It still connects the brain to the body, but it also links the brain to the spinal cord to promote new connections. This latest technology can help a patient get stronger over time and have more function in their paralyzed limb, even when not connected to the machine. Keith Thomas is the first person to benefit from the double neural bypass. At age 42, Thomas became paralyzed from his chest down.
I was in Montauk for the weekend, and I drove into the wrong end of the pool.
The impact of diving into a shallow part of the pool was enough to break his neck.
And it fractured his vertebrae and damaged his spinal cord at the C4, 5, and 6 levels. And he was paralyzed from about mid-chest down, even had shoulder impairment initially, and then couldn't lift his arms even off of his wheelchair rests, only about an inch.
Thomas spent 8 months in the hospital during the pandemic. He met Boughton soon after and qualified for the double neural bypass study in 2021. It took a while for the researchers to map his brain and figure out where the chip should be implanted. But in 2023, Thomas finally got the surgery.
This whole paralyzation, being quadriplegic in itself is just a pain in the butt, and you have to have a lot of patience. So I knew it wasn't going to happen overnight. Once I started getting involved in the study, I knew it was going to take a while to for the computer to realize what I was thinking, and them mapping my brain for a year, not going to surgery right away.
5 microchips were implanted in Thomas's brain, divided between the motor and sensory areas. Since they have to connect to a computer, the pedestals are mounted onto the skull.
They sit low and they have little caps that you put on them just to protect them. And you don't submerge underwater, but you wouldn't normally do that anyway. But you basically can still just, quickly wash around, be careful. And then he comes into the lab and we connect up to those literally and plug in and plug his brain into the computer.
The brain signals reach his muscles through flexible patches of electrodes that are placed around his forearm. Another patch goes over his spinal cord to complete the second part of the double neural bypass. Boughton says it's performing just as his team had hoped.
After receiving a few months of stimulation over the spinal cord and doing all of the other things together, he basically doubled his arm strength. And now he can lift his arms all the way up to his face on each side and scratch his chin or wipe his mouth. And he's even starting to regain sensation in his wrist area on the contralateral side, so his right hand, which is opposite of where we implanted the chips in the brain. And it's because we believe from a combination of spinal cord stimulation and brain stimulation that we've been doing with these special patterns that are based on things that we learned about his particular brain activity and patterns.
Brain activity is different in each person. So even though Boughton was able to decode Thomas's brain signals, he has to start all the way over with each new patient to learn the exact language of their specific brain. While it used to take multiple hours over a few different sessions, the team has come up with techniques that allow them to learn the basic movements in about 15 minutes.
And we have a new method where we can now carry that over to future sessions. And we now have been able to, we call it trainingless decoding, where we can actually use training that we did even 2-3 weeks before. Sometimes we've even gone up to a month.
This progress is paving the way for users to eventually be able to do this all from the comfort of their home without having to recalibrate the technology. Once the signals have been decoded, they're fed back into the stimulation patches that are placed around the patient's forearm.
And we can target very specific muscle motor points, as they're called, or even muscle segments to move individual fingers and wrist and so on. And it can be used anywhere on the body.
But giving independence back to people with paralysis goes deeper than just movement. Those with complete paralysis don't have any sensation in the paralyzed limb. However, repairing this sensation wasn't a component of Boughton's first design. In fact, it was brought to the team's attention by a patient named Ian, who was the first person to regain movement by using this brain chip.
One day, months later, Ian commented that he could not feel the object. So he was thankful he could open his hand and pick things up and even take a drink from a cup, but he couldn't feel the cup at all. And he said it was very disconcerting and very also disorienting, because if he closed his eyes, he couldn't even tell exactly where his arms or hands were in space, couldn't feel things. And then think about the personal aspect, couldn't hold a loved one's hand and feel their hand. So at that moment, I knew we had to do something.
Though it took nearly a decade, Boughton's team finally had a breakthrough last year. They discovered that placing microchips in both the motor cortex and sensory area of the brain will help patients regain some of their lost sensation. While Thomas has made great progress with his mobility and strength, he's also been able to feel again for the first time since his accident.
I got feeling below the injury on my right hand, like around my wrist area. So it's kind of cool. Me personally, like petting my dog or hugging my sister or something like that. Like when it's really personal, it feels really good.
Despite all the progress that's been made, the research team continues to work towards their goal. And though it will be years before they accomplish everything they set out to, Boughton says participants like Thomas continue to inch them closer to success.
I like to say Keith and others that have participated in our studies are really the pioneers of this field. And they're trying some things that have never been done before. And they're working really hard, not only for themselves, but for the things we're learning and for the science and research aspects. Because we explain to all of our participants that these techniques and technologies may or may not be beneficial to them, but we hope that we learn something that will help people in the future. And every single participant, including Keith, has said it's worth it.
You can find more information about Chad Boughton, Keith Thomas, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.